Now let's turn our attention to the main menu options in RStudio. At first glance, it looks like there is a whole lot more for us to cover, but it turns out that's not actually the case. Most of the options that you see in the menus are actually items that are duplicates of what we've seen with the tabs and the icons. For example, we know that we can open projects and look at recent projects right over here. If we look at editing, find and replace, we know that there is an icon for doing that right over here. If we look at what to view, notice all these: show history, show files, show plots. All those do are move to that particular tab. So if I click on show plots, now the plots pane is what's showing because that tab is selected. So most of the items up here are either self-explanatory, like opening a file, or they're duplicates of things we've seen before. So let me point out just a couple of the highlights. One feature that I really like in terms of opening projects is this one, opening a project in a new session. What that will allow me to do, and I can get to that over here by the way, open project in new session. What that will allow me to do is open another instance of RStudio. So if I click on this and then choose a project, it will actually create another instance of RStudio, so I can actually have two RStudios running with two separate projects in them. Under the code menu items, there's not much really that I use. There are some debugging functions that we'll get into later. Down here, I sometimes will use these to run certain segments of code, but as I've shown you, you can also select what segment of code you want and then run that selection right from within the script pane. Under View, all these down here, as I've mentioned, don't really do anything different than just clicking on a tab. I do use, sometimes when I teach, I use the zoom in and the zoom out to make my scripts bigger or smaller, well, typically bigger, for when I'm teaching in class and I'm online and I want people to be able to see it better. I will zoom in, and then clicking back to actual size will take it the way that you had it before. All of these plot options are already available in the icons under the plot window. Build is for building packages, which we're not going to talk about. Debugging is for fixing scripts. We'll look at anything available to us there much later in the course. Profiling is for optimizing code. So much of this up here you're never going to need to use. In other words, what you're seeing right here on the panes with the tabs and with the icons can control pretty much everything that you need to control. The help we've already looked at will show you different aspects of this help pane, but there are a couple nice little things. You can look here under RStudio Docs. This will actually take you to the web to documentation about RStudio. Later we're going to look at our Markdown, and the Markdown quick reference will provide you Markdown quick reference right here so that you can do it right within RStudio. So there's a couple things that are nice to have in the help. Cheat sheets, that's my favorite. Under the cheat sheets, you can also get these just by searching on the web. We can get different cheat sheets that we can print out. I have a whole book of these that allow you to very quickly remind yourself of what a function is or how the code should look. If you think that I have it all memorized, think again. I don't. I use cheat sheets on a regular basis. The R Markdown cheat sheet, for instance, is very much like what you see if you go here to Markdown Quick Reference. But the cheat sheet allows you to print it out. I actually print it and put it in a little plastic folder, and then I put that in a notebook. I'll show you sometime when you're looking at me on the webcam, and you can see that I have pretty much all of these in my little notebook and then some. You can click on Browse Cheat Sheets to see if there are additional ones that are not even showing right here. So that's worth knowing about. But what I really want to spend most of my time with right now is on the tools, and specifically on the global options. I've mentioned before that we can set project options, which will set how things look and work just for that project. I never use this because I usually want things to work the same way for all my projects. So I go here to global options. So let's look at some of the most important options within this global options menu. So we have two tabs, basic and advanced. I don't change anything in the advanced, and I would recommend you do the same. But under basic, there's a few things that I have changed. If you want to use an earlier version of R, as we've discussed, primarily because a package doesn't run in the most current version, you can change that right here, but normally you're going to want to leave it to be the most current version of R. I don't use this default working directory because notice it says when not in a project, and anyone who has had classes with me know that I constantly am saying make sure you open a project. Here you could start your most recently opened project at startup, which is the way I have it checked, or if you uncheck it, it will just start without starting in a project. Down here, you can restore your previous workspace at startup or not. And here you can save your workspace on exit. The default, I believe, is to ask, so that every time you close R, it asks if you want to save the workspace. I have mine on never. And the reason I do is because I don't ever need to save the workspace. If I want to have the workspace, I can simply run the scripts that I want again. But I find having the workspace loaded more of a nuisance than a help, because normally what happens when I start R is I'm wanting perhaps to start on a new script in which the first thing I need to do is clear the workspace. So I have mine set to never, and you might want to do the same thing. You have an option to save the history every time you're exiting R, even when you don't have this set to always or ask. But if you say never, you can still save the history automatically. I've never seen really a need for that. And let's see, these last two are notifying me of updates and sending crash reports. Those are optional. So this one with the workspace is really the big one. And then up here, you can put your preference as to whether you want every time you start RStudio for it to start fresh, or whether you want to assume that you probably are starting at the most recent project. Since you're going to have one project for this class, and most of the time when you start R, it's going to be for this class, having this checked means you always will be taken back to that project. Now let's look under code. There's a couple things that are of interest to me. One is I use tabs and I insert spaces for tabs. I'm going to talk about that a little later when I talk about text files and flat files. Rather than having a tab character, I want to insert spaces. It doesn't matter to me how big you make this, whether it's 2, 3, 4, 5, but I think it is important that when you click the tab key, rather than putting in a tab character, it's putting in that number of spaces. The other thing of interest is this soft wrap. I actually have mine set, but I don't use it. What soft wrap means is when you get to the end of your script pane here, when you get over here and you keep typing, it will actually wrap around and keep going even though you didn't hit the enter key. I purposefully hit the enter key every time I come to the end of my pane. In fact, you notice something here. I have a line set where I want to end, and I always make sure that I end by that line. This has been set to be 80 spaces. I'll show you how to do that. And by the time I reach the end of those 80 spaces, I hit an enter key. So I don't use soft wrap, even though, as you saw, I had it checked. It really doesn't make a difference to me whether it's checked or not because I don't use it. If you're going to source your R script, this says anytime you hit the source, which means run the script, save it first before you hit it. Okay, then under display, this is where I am setting that line at a margin column of 80, and you can set it as you want, but if you want a line to show you you've entered this many characters, that is a good way to do it. You might not know now why you would want to do that, but when we start talking about R syntax and grammar and style, you're probably going to want to put that in. Everything else here, I think I have left as defaults. And I believe that everything else on the rest of these I've left as defaults.